Okay. I've started recording.
We're good to go. Welcome everyone to the USA presentation. We're going to start off with a recording from Jelly. Unfortunately, she's not able to attend today. And it's going to start off with the nature and geography of the United States.
Perfect.
Hey everybody, hello server. Thank you so much for coming to join us for our presentation about the United States. Unfortunately, I, Jelly, cannot be here right now live because I'm at work. However, I recorded all of this for you and I hope that you can enjoy it and learn a little bit and that it's interesting to you. We put this together because we really wanted to share some information that we know and that we've researched about our country. And if you have any questions or you just want to talk about what we're talking about, please just type in the chat that's called question and answer that Oriana put together. All right, guys, thank you so much and enjoy. Buen día a todos y bienvenidos a nuestra presentación sobre los Estados Unidos. Por desgracia, no puedo estar aquí ahorita por mi trabajo, pero voy a hablar por mis grabaciones y espero que las disfruten. Muchas gracias por estar aquí hoy y vamos a hablar de algunos temas de nuestro país. Y si quieren hablar o preguntar sobre un tema o el país, pueden hablar o escribir en el canal de texto abajo de esto. Muchas gracias. Okay, hi everyone. So I'm going to start our presentation off with talking a little bit about the United States and the regions and our geography because it's very diverse. So first off, something that many of you know already, we have 50 states. 48 of them are, connected on the, I guess you would say, mainland, and the other two, Alaska and Hawaii, which are those two gray ones that are separate on the map, those are in different areas. Hawaii is in the Pacific Ocean, and Alaska is up north, connected to Canada. We have 14 territories, 5 which are inhabited. We have multiple regions or general ways that the country is split up into a few different sections based on where they're located. And lastly, I'm going to go over some varied climates and geography based on where different parts of the country are located, states, how they are different, and how most Americans know the differences between the country. Alright, so this is the map of the United States. You can see all 50 states here. If you take a look up in the northeast corner around New York, those states are much smaller and closer together. That's because when the country first started, there were only 13 colonies, and those states up there evolved from there. Those are the oldest states up top. Now, some of our members, we're all from some different states. Actually, Supernova is from New York, and I am from New York as well. However, if you look at New York, there is an island that you can't see. It's called Long Island. It comes off the bottom tip, and it goes out into the Atlantic on the east. It kind of looks like a fish. I live there, but Supernova lives upstate New York, which is in the teal blue area. Jordan, he lives in Rhode Island, also in the northeast. We have MB down in the south in Kentucky. And Icelandia is all the way across the country in California on the west coast. So this is just a photo from space that NASA took. It's at night, obviously. This is a real photo. If you notice on the east side, there are way more lights, way more people. It's much more heavily populated. That's where you have your, bigger cities, especially over up in the Northeast. You can see New York, New Jersey, that area. You can see the bottom down Florida, the part that comes out of the southeast corner of the U.S. Then if you look over on the other side, you see California. And a little bit later, Jordan and Glendia are going to talk a little bit about, the history of the United States and why certain places, do have many more people than other places. Okay, so these are the 5 flags representing the 5 inhabited territories by the United States. So on the top left, I think the most recognizable one, is Puerto Rico, or Puerto Rico, as most Americans say it. And we have Guam on the top right, U.S. Virgin Islands in the center, and then we have American Samoa and Northern Mariana Islands on the bottom. You may know that some of these territories are fighting for their statehood, so that they can be taken a little more seriously for being part of the continental United States. For example, Puerto Rico, their residents cannot vote in our presidential election. They're considered part of the country, but they're fighting for their statehood. So we're rooting for them, and we hope that one day these territories, if they wish to do so, can be part of the continental United States as official states. These are some photos of our beautiful territory islands, the 5 that I mentioned. Some of them are located in the Caribbean and the others in the Pacific. Okay, so this is generally how the United States is split up into its regions. So we have the West, Midwest, South, and Northeast. If you look at the Northeast, it's where I mentioned the 13 colonies originally were. It's where a lot of the smaller states are, more heavily populated. The climate up there, since it's farther up north, is generally your typical climate that people think of when they think winter, spring, summer, fall. We get all 4 seasons. They are very different. It gets hot in the summer, cool in the spring and fall, kind of warm, and it is freezing in the winter, and you get a lot of snow. It's pretty nice being along the Atlantic Ocean on the east. You get some nice beaches up in Maine, which is the state that is furthest up top over here. There's that state and the other New England states like Massachusetts have also lived off of fishing for many years. Obviously now it's different, there's more food available, but back years and years ago, these states depended upon fishing and this coastal life. It's also where a lot of the United States' factories were way back in the 1800s, where things were produced for the rest of the country. And it's where the main cities began, and that's why there's not too much farming done around here, because there's mostly the factory areas. Now, if you look at the South, that is a gigantic section, and it is very different in there. All of the states are very different from one another. As you can see, Texas is this one right here, this gigantic state, which can fit almost half the United States smaller states in there. Texas is different from the others. It starts to have a climate that is similar to this area, which is almost desert-like, pretty dry, hot. But then if you go over here near Florida and these southern states like Georgia, Louisiana, The climate's very humid. It has that tropical climate almost. It's hot. It's usually sticky. There's a lot of thunderstorms. Over here, you have something called the Everglades, which are basically like these marshlands that have a lot of plants, a lot of wildlife, a lot of creatures. They're supposed to be protected because they keep getting ripped out so houses can be built. But that's a problem for another day. These states along here, these are also along the Atlantic Ocean, which is right here. And they have similar climates to down here. Just as you go further up north, it gets slightly less hot and a little more, easier to bear the heat. Over here in these states, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, those states were originally where a lot of farmland was. I mean, still is, but there's a good climate for growing certain crops. That is also something that Jordan's going to go into later. Explains how the U.S. was able to produce those crops, how it's changed, and how it is a little bit different today, or a lot of bit different. Up in the Midwest, so this area, there are not too many people living in these states, mostly, honestly, because the climate is terrible. So, over in the center of the country, you got a lot of tornadoes, really, really dry periods of time where they don't get too much rain. When they get snow in the winter, those blizzards can be absolutely insane. And I have a friend that lived in one of the Dakotas here, and north or south, I forgot which one. And he said it would go below 30 degrees with snow during the winter. These are lakes right here. Obviously, Canada's up here. But yeah, this is you have some major cities up here. Again, this is a very general introduction to these areas. I'm not going to go too in depth. I just want to make it, accessible and easy for people to take in who don't really know too much about these areas. And then if you take a look at the West, this is also a huge area. We have some of the states like California, Montana, Washington up top. These 4 states right here, these squarish looking states, those 4 have very, very desert-like climates. Very unique compared to the rest of the country, in my opinion. When I went there, I went to the state of Arizona, where the Grand Canyon goes through, one of the national parks, and it's very unique. All of the soil, the rocks, it's all orange, layered. There's desert creatures like snakes and lizards, armadillos. It's a really cool area, in my opinion. And then California is very unique in itself as well, because it is along the ocean. Obviously, you can't see in this map that Mexico is over here. So these states border Mexico, even the tip of California. But over here, this part of California along the ocean has much different climate. It's usually very cool. It's different from the East Coast oceans. The West Coast oceans are rockier, different color water, clearer. It's that Pacific versus Atlantic. It's just not the same. Again, this is a very So Yellowstone, these gorgeous bright blue-green pools that are there. Basically, this park is famous, so famous that National Geographic is literally all over it. All the time they have all these videos and, documentaries and stuff like that. Anyway, these pools are gorgeous, and they're hot, but you cannot swim in them. They're incredibly acidic, and you could get really bad chemical burns. So these are just some pictures of Yellowstone. It says, relive the journey into America's first national park, home to some of the nation's most iconic animals, wilderness, and super volcanoes. So that is Yellowstone in Wyoming. Okay, so I looked up the most famous national parks in the United States so that we can kind of stay focused on the ones that are most well known. So this is Hawaii National Volcanoes National Park. So this is comprised of separate volcanoes in Hawaii, because the way that the Hawaiian Islands have been formed is by a hotspot under the Pacific Plate. So the Pacific tectonic plate has moved very, very slowly over time, but as it moves, the hotspot of magma that once it either hits the water as lava or it hits the air, it creates new land, and that's how we have the islands over time in Hawaii. Now here's another national park. This one is in Utah, which is a state in the southwest United States. This is a personal favorite of mine just because I love these rock formations. Y también aquí pueden ver que hay mucha información en español sobre los parques. Hay videos y otra información también. Es muy útil para todos, para turistas, para otros estadounidenses. Sí, y quieren visitar los parques de los Estados Unidos. Hay mucha información para ustedes. So this happens to be my favorite national park. This is Grand Canyon National Park. It is mostly in Arizona. It also peeks a little bit into the surrounding states. As you can see, it is stunning. These national parks, especially this one, have a really, really, really rich geologic history. Years and years and years. Rock layering, erosion. Okay, so the next few slides are about Long Island, which is part of the state of New York, which is where I live. Some of the things that people like to do when they visit are basically the beaches, I would say, or out east. So the beaches that we have on the South Shore, the most popular one is called Jones Beach State Park. It is a New York state park. And if you're a visitor from the city or you're a tourist from, another country or state, a lot of times people come to see the beach. It's personally not my favorite beach. The one next to it, called Toa Bay Beach, is. It's a little bit emptier. It's for county residents. They're both beautiful, and they're kept up by the state. and the wildlife is protected. It's really cool places. They are really cool places to visit, especially at the end of like a hot summer day, or for the whole day. They have nice clean water. And yeah, that's just a little bit about some of the beaches. Out east, there are some vineyards, there's a lot of farmland, there are farm stands, places where people sell their fruits and vegetables. It's a very calm place where there's not a lot of traffic, and people kind of go out there to relax for the day. Long Island itself is a pretty small place, but it has almost 7.5 million people living in it. So it's pretty crowded. Actually, I think that number is greater because that population count was from 2019. But yeah, so the island is evolving and a lot is changing and improving as well. However, it's getting incredibly crowded, which makes it difficult for people to drive to and from work. There's a lot more traffic everywhere you go, even if it's across town. So yeah, there's pros and cons of more and more people coming to live in the area.
Alright. Many thanks to Jelly. Ooh. Is everyone good? Was that good? Does anyone have any questions about the climate or anything that anyone else from the group of English natives would like to add on, perhaps?
No, thank you, Jelly. I mean, I know she's not here right now, but that was amazing. And now we will get ready to hear a Kalindia talk about the beginning of history. Yeah, take the stage.
All right. So, as you can tell from the pictures here, our little story, I will be covering the early history of the United States leading up to the Civil War, maybe give you guys a little bit of background information on how the United States came to be and what are the events that lead us to be the way we are today. When you look at the United States now, what are the defining moments in our past that have made us who we are? I chose to go kind of far back for the very first slide here. This is multiple tens of thousands of years ago, back to when the people first came to North America. I won't spend too much time. You guys have all probably heard this in your history classes already, of how at least most people think that, the humans crossed over from Russia, across the Bering Strait to Alaska, modern day Alaska, I mean. And they began to populate the North American continent. The only point of interest I want to bring up here is that many of these people who we will become the people we now know as Native Americans, at least in the United States region, these were hunter-gatherers. They went around. If they see a bison or a woolly mammoth walking, then they follow it, maybe hunt it down, and then the next day they'll set up camp, or they'll pick up camp, move somewhere else, and rinse, wash, repeat. Just start the whole process over again. That's how they lived their lives. There weren't that much settled farming until maybe the first evidence of farming in North America actually came from Mexico, which is beyond the scope of my presentation, unfortunately. So it's all very interesting history, but within modern-day United States, the Native Americans there were hunter-gatherers. There are a couple of significant cultures within our past. If you look back, we have evidence, for example, here in West Virginia, or I say here, in the United States in West Virginia, the Adena tribe, or the Adena people, I should say, 500 years BCE, they were making mounds for burial, for funerals, and only now, in recent centuries, we're uncovering this evidence of these previous cultures, who sort of laid way for the societies and the cultures that would eventually come into clash when the Europeans would come to North America, to the Americas as a whole, I suppose, within the middle of the 20th of the second millennia. There's lots of, and then it's difficult to classify them all into one piece. I tried to take samples from people of the various different regions across the United States. The Grave Creek Mound here in West Virginia, on the other side of the country in New Mexico, or closer to Central America, there's loads of evidence as well from people who practice irrigation farming. And then in Hawaii, they have probably one of the most unique, or they have a very unique history compared to much of the rest of continental America, in which the people who arrived at Hawaii actually they were Polynesians and Tahitians. I'm afraid I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, but they came from the seafaring societies from the Polynesian islands. As you can see in the map depicted in the top right, they only came to Hawaii maybe roughly 1,000 years, or in the year 1000 or so, which is much later than people came to the rest of the North America, South America, Central, the rest of the continents. Carbon, at least that's what we think from carbon dating. And once the year 1000 is very interesting because that's actually when we believe the first Europeans arrived at North America, not the Spaniards or the conquistadors or the explorers that we think of today, but in fact a group of Vikings under the banner that we believe of Leif Erikson sailed across the very northern end of the Pacific Ocean, made their way across Greenland, and settled in North America. They landed in the region of North America today in the year roughly 1000. So this is all very fascinating that we think that of the people who are here before the Europeans, at least the Europeans we think of today, first arrived. However, eventually we make our way. In this context of the United States of America, the very first colonists, the people who founded the first colonies that would eventually become the United States, I should say, these were the British. In 1590, Elizabeth I chartered for the first colony to make an attempt at making their own lifestyle within North America. This would be in Roanoke, founded in, I believe, 1585. Unfortunately, the first attempt was not successful, and this is one of the greater mysteries of the early colonies within North America. When there was another exploration team sent behind them to check 1590, roughly, when this painting, or picture, I should say, was drawn in the top left, the Roanoke colony had been completely abandoned, fortified, but not a soul to be seen. There's a lot of conflicting theories as to whether they had been integrated into Native American tribes, or if they had been massacred, or if they had simply fled the area. There is a lot of different competing theories going around, and we still do not know exactly what went down. So that's one of the greater mysteries of the past of these colonial era settlements. The first successful one, our gentleman in the bottom right over here, King James I, he eventually, 30-ish years after the Roanoke colony failed, settled for the London Company to charter their own settlement, which would become the Jamestown colony, named after himself. Very humble, right? So, but that's just a naming scheme that many of the settlements in this era followed. So, they became the Jamestown colony within Virginia. And the situation was a little bit dire. They made the settlement during a drought in the middle of a swamp, and a little bit too late in the year to be able to grow their own crops, or at least effectively so. By the time that they were able to obtain aid from across the seas, 2/3 of the settlers here had actually died already. It's a very harsh and unforgiving sort of environment that they had found themselves in. And while the Native Americans were very well accustomed to the regions and had sort of left the swamp area untouched because it was such a poor choice of place to build a town, that was where the Jamestown colony had to make their way. Eventually, through a couple of agreements, I suppose, trade agreements with the Native American tribes, at least temporarily, these relations would worsen over time, but not for the moment. And as well with the discovery that they would be able to grow tobacco well, as depicted in the bottom left here, a very popular product making its way around Europe. They were able to attract more settlers and sort of develop themselves as a colony. the growth of tobacco as a popular product would also begin to see the use of what would be called indentured servants, people who would be working for very little to practically zero pay, or a lot of the times actually zero pay, in order to pay off their own personal debts. But they would be trapped in these cycles of just incurring debt from working in order to pay off their own debt. So they would be effectively granted the same workload as what amounts to slavery. Now, they're not slaves, not yet. That's an issue for a later moment in American history. But for the moment, that's how it went down. We also see here the Mayflower arriving, a pretty legendary moment within, I guess, American history as well. A lot of people died on the trip over, very harsh conditions. But they gave birth to one of the longest lasting, I say longest lasting, one of sort of the American traditions that we practice every year, which is Thanksgiving. This was held in Jamestown as well. But the one in Plymouth is particularly notable as the stories of that are told today, where we have the Plymouth colonists who arrived, and they were able to hold this sort of gathering, this feast after the first full harvest, where they were also able to invite Native American tribes over and sort of hold this period of, as the name Thanksgiving implies, of giving thanks for sort of the circumstances that allowed for their prosperity. Eventually, we begin to make our way towards the colonies today. The 13, or not today, but the colonies that would give birth to the United States. At this point in time, they're referred to as the 13 colonies, held under British rule, and sort of making their own way with trade between Native Americans, between other colonies founded by various other European nations. We see here on the map that sort of division of land around 1750-ish, before war began, that would begin to shape the identity of the North American, at least the 13 colonies. We see the division between the Spanish, the French, and the United Kingdom, and these were the three biggest powers that would hold territory here within the continent. Unfortunately, it wouldn't last that long. You see here at the bottom, French and British relations and going to war with each other. Name a more iconic duo, right? We have the French and Indian War that begins, a sideshow of the 7 Years' War in Europe, and this would see the French and Indians sort of removed as a debilitating threat to the colonies in the Americas. Backed by British forces, because they're still a British colony at this time, they're able to sort of defeat the French and whichever Native Americans. I make the mistake of referring to them as Indians. That's the sort of, I guess, old school name given to them, as it's what Columbus had referred to them mistakenly. But the Native Americans who had backed the French, they were also removed from as a viable force that could threaten sort of colonial settlements at the time. Unfortunately, after the 7 Years' War, after the French and Indian Wars, the United Kingdom, in the attempts to back the 13 colonies, as well as the wars across Europe too, but in the context of the United States, the attempts to back the 13 colonies had left them in a great amount of debt. In order to sort of pay for this, a tax was imposed on the many colonial products in order to pay back this debt. Unfortunately for the British, in what can only be described as a very highly American moment, the people of the colonies were outraged that the government would ever raise taxes on them. Granted, the outrage wasn't over the value of the taxes, which were already lower than what their British counterparts were paying, but since they had no control over these taxes, and the decisions were left up to Parliament back in the British Isles, or in the back in Great Britain, this led to an idea that took root known as no taxation without representation. The colonies saying, if we cannot have a say in the laws that apply taxes to us, then you should not be able to actually apply taxes to us. This, of course, just led to conflicts between the colonies and the royal crown of the United Kingdom. And the situation got worse, especially when violence began. And one instance where colonials were violently harassing British soldiers in Boston, the soldiers, without orders, retaliated, firing back and killing 5 of the colonists. This event, known as the Boston Massacre, was widely published, sparking outrage across the colonies. 3 years later, conflict would again arise. Here you see in the middle a depiction of the Boston Tea Party, which is what happened when a group of an organized group known as the Sons of Liberty, actively protesting the taxes, especially around tea in this instance. The aborted ships that were carrying entire shipments of tea and tossed it basically right into the Boston Harbor. This, in turn, caused a crackdown from the British government for imposing trade restrictions and increasing the number of soldiers present. As you can imagine, soldiers from across the sea governing how the colonial matters would be done, that didn't sit too well with the people. There's definitely a feeling of legend that surrounds the start of the United States, and some of the more patriotic moments that define it. These two events here, the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, are textbook examples taught nationwide as the 13 colonies descended the path towards war. Notably, it also leads to a long-running joke that on hot summer days, the harbor, if you smell and just listen to put your nose towards the sea breeze, you can actually still smell the harbor smelling like tea. But that's just one of the sort of legends. And the Boston Tea Party is not a legend. It's an actual historical event, but it's made its way within sort of folklore and the history of the United States. Of course, this leads us to war. Probably the most defining war in American history because it's what made us, right? After British soldiers ran into American militia on the march to seize stored weapons and powder at Concord in 1775, this sort of kicked off the battle where shots were fired, and eventually we would see the colonies descending this full-blown path towards warfare with the mother country, the United Kingdom. 1 year later, after the creation of the Continental Army and the recapture of Boston, the United States would actually formally publish the Declaration of Independence and send it to Britain on the July of 1776. This day is officially counted as the birthday of the United States within American history, which we celebrate every year on July the 4th. We have fireworks, we have hot dogs, we have corn dogs, the whole shebang. Festivities galore. It's also worth noticing, this is more for the people who have a better idea of American history, but there was actually a group of people loyal to the British Crown who signed something at the same time known as the Declaration of Dependence in sort of response to the sending off the Declaration of Independence, and I just thought the idea of that was the funniest thing, especially because we almost never hear about it. I suppose it just wasn't that effective overall. Ultimately, this war would last until 1783. With the help of foreign aid, notably by the French, the colonies gained independence and an agreement of sovereignty by the British Crown, leading up all the way up to the Mississippi River, where they basically said, we won't interfere with your affairs, you're on your own now. And I sort of made this picture on the right. You can see this, just the sort of depiction of the French helping to defeat the British after the British helped defeat the French in this sort of ironic turn of events that eventually helped us gain independence. So, we're a newfound nation, all on our own. What do we do? The first step, you have to make a government. There was an attempt to make something called the Articles of Confederation, ratified 1781, but it was no good, no bueno. There was the weakness in the Articles of Confederation showed that the government needed to be unified, otherwise they couldn't really deal with threats to the sort of rule of power. Ironically, the events that would show this weakness were raised over protest of taxes, which is the same issue that the colonies brought up with the United Kingdom. So you can see where the issue is here. The Constitution itself was signed in 1789, and I'll cover this briefly. It's sort of the ultimate law of the land. The Constitution says that there's a federal government, central in power but still democratic in nature, with 3 words, we the people, that make clear the guarantee that the government works for the people and not the other way around. It's also one of the most famous phrases in American history, and admittedly, the number of people who can actually recite the Constitution dropped significantly after getting past those 3 words, me included, but those 3 words, we the people, definitely encompass the idea that the Constitution is trying to get behind. It also divides the government into 3 powers, legislative, executive, judicial. I won't get into the details too much, but the whole idea is that there's a system of checks and balances, that one branch is not going to have ultimate power over the other two, that there's no supreme leader here, that each one of these will have carry their own weight within government, and if one of them gets out of hand, the other two are able to act in kind to sort of put it in its place. The executive branch, the sort of president of the United States, judicial, the courts, the laws, interpretation of the law, and the legislative, who sets the laws out, right? That's the whole division of power within the United States. All right, where were we in history? Oh yes, kicking the British out, all that jazz. Well, the United States is a proper wee lad at this point, and it's looking to grow and show how much of an adult it is in the whole worldwide stage. Domestically, leaps and bounds are made with growth, especially with the development of the U.S. Supreme Court as a viable part of the government, and with the Louisiana Purchase. There's another joke that I actually read on Reddit the other day about the Louisiana Purchase, in which it sort of ran as the British funding an invasion of themselves. Let me explain for a moment. The funds that the U.S. obtained to buy the whole Louisiana territory, highlighted here in the polka dots here, or in the gray dots, this massive swath of territory used to be French territory that the U.S. purchased using money lent from a British bank. And then the U.S. used it to purchase the territory, which the money went to France, and France would use that money to actually fund an army that would, with the intended goal of invading the British. That never happened, but it's sort of an interesting sort of turn of events, the way that happened. In either case, Louisiana Purchase, massive swaths of territory going into U.S. hands, and this leads to the concept of manifest destiny, this sort of ideology that would take hold of the U.S. for the next 100 years or so, in which the U.S. would begin the westwards expansion, pushing towards the Pacific from sea to shining sea, as the saying goes, touching both the Atlantic and the Pacific. That dream won't be achieved for many, many years, but this is the start of it. There's also, I guess we can skip over, there's a lot of intricacies with the foreign affairs that happen, especially going to war with the British again, but it doesn't play too much a role in the grand scope of the U.S., though there is a funny incident with the burning of the U.S. Capitol, of the White House, that actually leads eventually, when the United States defeats the British for the second time, though not necessarily in a whole act of glory, that's where the United States anthem comes from, the Star-Spangled Banner, based on a British sort of tune, I suppose, depicting victory in our second combat with the United Kingdom. Unfortunately, we have to also talk about the pros and the cons. There's a lot of negatives that came with the expansion, not to the United States necessarily, but to the people affected by it. It would not be right to go without mentioning the Native Americans and the tribes that were gravely affected by the westwards expansion, especially the Trail of Tears, when in 1830 the Indian Removal Act forcibly moved almost half a dozen Native American tribes westwards to allow for American expansion. During this process, tens of thousands died from exposure, illness, starvation, and maltreatment, and these acts have been referred to many times as death marches. These tragic acts have left their scar upon the cultures of those affected to this day, and it would dishonor all involved to ignore these moments of American history. As the United States moved west, there is another growing issue at hand. States to the north, not requiring forced labor for their industries, were beginning to remove slavery, as their industries could run well without the use of slaves. However, southern states requiring more and more slaves to run increasingly profitable cotton plantations. The technology, the development was there, allowing us, the southern states, to sort of mass produce cotton as a whole, but they needed the people to run these, and that's where slave labor came into play. A delicate balance of power began growing between these different regions in the north and the south of different ideologies. And this was especially exacerbated, if I go back to the previous slide. You see the California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. This whole territory gained during the Mexican American War in 1846 and 1848. That would only upset the balance of power. This new land, where does it go? Is it slave owning? Is it not? Eventually, the question over states' rights and whether states had the right to determine their own future and whether they could own slaves, or if it was the government, the central government of the U.S., that could dictate the path of the future as a whole. This led the southern states to eventually secede. In 1861, much of this issue around the central government and states' rights and the whole southern area leading, I believe, up to Virginia and sort of this division line right about here. States south of there would secede from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. States to the north would remain in the Union, though they would not acknowledge the independence of the Confederate States, instead going to war to, as Abraham Lincoln put it, sort of the restoration of the Union. However, in order to preserve, eventually as the war drew on, and sort of motivated by foreign affairs to keep foreigners from trying to, I suppose, foreign nations from intervening in the war to reestablish the cotton trade, and as well as an aspect of sort of morality that is slowly developing this wave of this movement that is growing in order to sort of abolish slavery across the whole of the United States. The Civil War eventually became a war through the Emancipation Proclamation issued by Abraham Lincoln to defeat slavery as a whole, as an institution. Eventually in 1865, 4 long years afterwards, the Civil War would come to an end, leading to a sort of America that has fought with itself and come out war-torn, and it would need to put itself together. And from here, I lend the reins over to Jordan, who will talk to us about the future after the Civil War leading to the present.
Hello, everyone. So I know my slides are a little more lengthy. As you can see, there's a lot more text. I'll be simplifying it in the speaking portion, but for those who like a little extra reading, or for the more advanced English learners, you have some good information to read. So after the Civil War, there was the Reconstruction Era, and every slide will have the time periods too. So slavery was abolished. The Confederate States who were fighting against the Union, Lincoln made a plan. Abraham Lincoln was the president at the time. He made a plan to bring them back into the Union, and it was called the 10% Plan. Unfortunately, he died. So Andrew Johnson, his vice president, took over, and his plan involved essentially giving every Confederate state, free pardons, meaning they could come back into the Union immediately as long as they say, I support the Union and I support emancipation. As long as they did that, then they could be states, which was much more relaxed than Lincoln's plan. Unfortunately, though, even if this was the case, a lot of southern states implemented black codes, which were laws in the South to restrict the rights of African Americans or blacks. And in this first picture here, you can see Andrew Johnson. That is the president at the time, and that is the example of the 15th Amendment, which allowed everyone to vote. Every man at the time. Unfortunately, women could still not vote. So African American men and white men could all vote. However, in the South, with the black codes, there were still things like grandfather clauses or voting polls, which were all just different tests to see if black people were qualified to vote. So sometimes they would pay a fee. Sometimes you'd have to, some of them you'd have to have your grandfather be able to vote. That means you can vote. If your grandfather couldn't vote, you can't, which meant that for most African Americans, their grandfathers were slaves, meaning they couldn't vote. So it was very unfair, even though, it felt like a victory for the Union. It was actually not really victory for African Americans. And a group appeared at this time called the Ku Klux Klan. They were recognized actually by the government as a terrorist organization because they would mob and kill African Americans simply for being black. The president after Andrew Johnson, Ulysses Grant, he passed enforcement acts, which they essentially were used against the Ku Klux Klan until they disappeared. Enforcing equal rights for African Americans, kind of breaking away at the black codes to make sure that it's as desegregated as possible. But segregation still persisted because Grant didn't necessarily do enough to enforce these. Next, we have the Gilded Age. This is from 1870 to 1900. There's a lot going on here. There was a lot of economic growth. but it was very unstable. There was a lot of more immigrants from Europe. Not so much from other areas yet. We'll get to that later. But right now, it's mainly just European immigrants. Although there's also always been a kind of a constant influx of Mexican immigrants as well, because as we can remember, the Mexican American War kind of made all these old Mexicans now Americans. So they kind of went through the process of being citizens just from that whole ordeal. The new transportation of railroads and trains became very important for getting not only people, but cargo across the country. The rich became richer and the poor became poorer. And that created a big divide, but it also created a new growing middle class in between. And the amount of new immigrants coming in, particularly the Irish and the Germans, made it harder for certain people because employers could always find cheaper labor in immigrants. They would always pay the Irish or the German immigrants less because they knew they were desperate. And with these things, there was the growth of billionaires, millionaires, like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and Cornelius Vanderbilt. Those are the three portraits in the middle there on the left. On the top here, this is a portrait of the concept of manifest destiny. So if we look at it here, you can see all these farmers. They're kind of, and you can see on the left here in the darkness, those are Native Americans. So they're pushing out the Native Americans. And this angel-looking figure is kind of like a symbol of like, this is, our land, our freedom, our hope kind of thing, even though it's not their land. So the growth of farming was very prevalent during this time, and they spread across the Midwest and into the West as well. So farming got much bigger. There were entire organizations dedicated to making sure, farmers had rights and they could be involved in politics. And the same thing happened in the cities with the growth of labor unions. Now, there was also a few depressions during the time, pretty bad situations with the economy. We'll get to the biggest one, the Great Depression, later, but these ones were still pretty influential at the time. More people were beginning to vote. But also the politics were becoming more corrupt. And then here are some terms that are important at the time. So the development of political machines was common at the time, which were large groups of basically politicians that they would kind of be able to manipulate votes and get votes for themselves. It was a very corrupt system at the time. And then there was a spoils system, which was another one of these corrupt systems where the political leaders themselves would only choose their friends as politicians. But some things improved, like education, and there was a lot of new sports created, like baseball and football. And there's a picture of baseball shown here on the bottom left. In the top right here, this is an image kind of the corrupt organizations, the corrupt politicians controlling the government. They all have like names in them like trust and monopoly. Those are types of kind of organizations that will be dealt with in the next slide, which is we have the Spanish American War. Forgot about that. That's right in between. So this happened in 1898. It actually was not that long. It lasted only 10 weeks. But basically what happened is there was the independence movement in Cuba, and Spain kind of took over. Like they won that battle. But the U.S. kind of supported Cuba because Spain took some pretty drastic measures. They put the Cuban, independentistas, I think it would be. They put them in concentration camps. So the U.S. made all these claims in their journals, in the newspapers, saying that, oh my gosh, they're being sleep deprived, they're being starved, they're being killed off by the new government. So when in 1898 the USS Maine exploded, which was a battleship that was owned by the U.S. It was stationed in Havana Harbor. The president declared war on Spain, and then what happened is the United States won. The bottom left here is Theodore Roosevelt invading San Juan. And then on the right here, this is, I don't think it's Theodore Roosevelt, but it's another U.S. Army in the Philippines. So after the war ended, after the United States won, Spain surrendered Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico at the 1898 Treaty of Paris. And then later on, the U.S. also bought some of the Virgin Islands. The territories were fighting for independence themselves, so they helped the Americans. But basically, the Americans, they kind of turned on them. And they turned all of their the new land that they won against the Spanish into their own colonies, their own territories. They brought in the military to take over the lands, and they also put in leaders that only listened to them. Some of these people fought back, particularly the Cubans and the Filipinos. The Filipinos fought back the hardest. They actually, I believe, bombed their own bay to try and take it over from the Americans, and they actually were able to fight back against a lot of Americans until they brought reinforcements. That was known as the Philippine American War. And this was actually not the first time that Americans had manipulated or controlled foreign nations. They did the same thing in Hawaii. They overthrew the Hawaiian Queen and annexed it as a state. So it was not a peaceful transition. Yeah. Now we have the Progressive Era. There's a lot more going on here, and this isn't even all of it. So I'm going to just shorten it down a little bit. The Progressive Era was right after the Gilded Age, and it was a period of more social activism and political reform. There was a few main objectives, which were related to the growth of industrialization, the growth of urbanization, the growth of immigration, and the growth of political corruption. Some of the big things that happened during this age were the Prohibition Era, where it was mainly religious based. A lot of religious women that alcohol was some kind of moral evil, and they wanted to ban alcohol sales at all. And then there was also prostitution that was seen as the social evil. And like I said, with the religious women being supporting prohibition, they also supported their own rights, because as of this time, women can still not vote. So this is the rise of women's suffrage or feminism. They kind of run hand in hand. So there was a lot of different activists at the time and a lot of different things. I'm not going to go too in depth on that. But there was also things that improved, like education. There was the growth of African American communities. They fought for more racial justice. The organization known as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, helped fight legal battles for African Americans. And there was 3 big presidents at the time. Those were Theodore Roosevelt, Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. The ones I'm really going to talk about are Roosevelt and Wilson. Roosevelt kind of made the government support the people at this time, so he was actively involved in the Progressive Era. He actually would talk to the people and the businesses and trying to make them work together in something he called the square trade, the square deal. He also worked to eliminate trusts. Trusts were these group organizations that owned a large amount of kind of wealth and property and assets, and he broke these trusts up to provide more fair competition for businesses. As you can see in the bottom left here with the bad trust and the good trust, that's a political cartoon showing how he was that trust buster, how he reined in the trusts. He passed several acts to expand the power of government. One of the biggest ones was the Pure Food and Drug Act that established the FDA. I think even other countries use the FDA today for their ratings of food and whatnot. So it's a pretty important act, that one in particular. But there was plenty of others that were also very important. after Roosevelt, there was Taft. He was a progressive president, but he didn't really do too much. And then in a four-way election, Wilson, this was Roosevelt's, I believe, third term, he lost that to Wilson, who is the one on the bottom right here. And he kind of just continued what Roosevelt and Taft started. He passed a lot more acts. His most important one is probably the Federal Reserve Act, where he changed the banks in the United States, creating something called the Federal Reserve. It gave more power to the government banks and less power to the private company banks. So it was more stable. And yeah, that's it here. We have post-World War II and the Roaring Twenties. So this time, the U.S. government passed laws actually like allowing for the spying of people because they were worried about, things like communism. That was called the Red Scare at the time. This was the first one. There's going to be multiple Red Scares over the course of history from now on. But this was the time of the first one where the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia scared Americans. And that's why they allowed this spying of people and suppressing, anti-war ideas because they thought that those people were socialists or communists. And then at this time, also in 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed that allowed women the right to vote. At the same time, there was a lot of African Americans leaving the South because, as you remember, the South was still very segregated. It was still not as, I wouldn't say that it's better in the North, but it was, but it wasn't like that people in the North were that much better because they still saw black people as inferior, but at least they weren't, killed or murdered as much. But it still did happen. So there was this great migration where all these African Americans left the South and went to the North to find better opportunities. And again, this is the pattern of immigration that has happened with a lot of immigrants, no matter where you're from Europe, from Latin America. A lot of them tend to go to the north because that is where a lot of the economic growth is happening in these large northern cities. So at the 1920s, it's also known as the Second Industrial Revolution because of these cities growing, actually. So places like New York, Chicago, even in California, that was growing as well because of the California gold rush at the time. And corporations continued to grow, but now they were more stable and reined in and not as corrupt because of Roosevelt's and Wilson's policies. The Prohibition Era had started at this point. So what happened was I believe the 20th Amendment was passed that allowed, banned alcohol. And it also raised crime because a lot of people, I guess, really liked alcohol. So they would, like people like Al Capone here on the left in the middle, they would, raid banks, create things called speakeasies, which were illegal bars, essentially, where they sold alcohol and there was dancing. Speaking of dancing, on the top here, on the top left, that's kind of an example of like what the 1920s stereotypically looks like. Actually, this is not the case. The 1920s, not all women wore short skirts, but it did happen, but it was mainly limited to certain small groups of people. The Ku Klux Klan sees a reemergence in the 20s. On the bottom left here, that's a picture from a movie at the time. It's called, I think, The Birth of a Nation. And that inspired the new Ku Klux Klan to emerge because the movie showed the original Ku Klux Klan as like heroes against, the blacks, which were seen as like kind of villains. So that's what caused the Ku Klux Klan, this terrorist organization to emerge again. Finally, in the 20s, there was the growth of jazz. This was the time of the Harlem Renaissance. So African culture and African music got exposed to not only just America, but the entire world. Now we have the Great Depression. This one's pretty short. I just simplified it with these charts here. So basically, it's very complicated for me even to explain or even understand as someone who's like lived in America my whole life. So I kind of just shortened it even in this. Basically, what happened is the stock market crashed in October 1929. Why it crashed is because a lot of reasons. Mainly, one of them was that America was giving money to Germany, I believe, to repay their World War I debt. And then Germany paid that money back to the UK, and then the UK paid that back to America. And it was a really silly process for Americans to help Europe. So they didn't do too good with that. That failed. And also, as you see here, the stockbrokers, which were the people that sold stocks, dealt with stocks, they gave out loans to banks. And then the banks used those loans to pay the people. So there was no actual money that was being given to people. It was credit money. So it was like money that was owed. So when the stock market crashed, the banks lost their money because they had no more money now. There's no credit. And then the people lost all their money. So basically, everyone was poor. And the presidents that came never really were able to fix this issue until Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR. He also, here on the right, these two charts, he passed two New Deals, is what they're called. There's two of them. During the period he called the 100 days. So in the first 100 days, he passed all this stuff. And then the second 100 days, he passed all this stuff on the bottom. And he also hosted radio broadcasts called Fireside Chats that boosted public support. And there was also the Dust Bowl at the time, which made the Great Depression worse. So not only were the cities suffering because they were all poor, but the farmers were because there was massive droughts and dust storms throughout actually from Texas all the way to the west. World War II. I'm not going to go too into specifics of what happened with America and Europe, but just what happened in America itself. The war actually kind of stimulated the economy so that America was able to get out of its depression, and it actually became very, very wealthy over the course of the war. Unfortunately, because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were put in internment camps, concentration camps, because there was a lot of racism towards Japanese because they were seen as the enemy. Same thing with the Germans, but more so the Japanese. There was also this one very odd incident. So on June 4th, 1943, U.S. sailors, like sailors from the Navy, the U.S. Navy, they went through Los Angeles and they went looking for Mexican Americans in something called a zoot suit. And then they would like literally beat them and like strip their clothes off. And this continued for 5 days, and it would just get worse and worse. And then the government stepped in. This picture on the right here, on the top right, is a picture of the Zoot Suit riots. Another thing that happened in World War II, and actually led to the end of World War II, was the Manhattan Project and the creation of the atomic bomb. So that's this picture on the bottom here. These are the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima was the first bomb dropped. And these were the second and third atomic bombs dropped of all time, and the only two bombs used in combat. The first atomic bomb was launched in New Mexico. So now we have the start of the Cold War. Now, tensions heightened after World War II between America and the Soviet Union. The Americans saw the Soviet Union as a threat. They saw communism as a threat. Remember, even since World War I, with the first Red Scare, we've always had a fear of communism, and it only got worse. So FDR he died actually before World War II ended. So his vice president took over, Harry Truman. He was not as good with talking with the other countries. People say that if FDR had survived, he would probably be able to get us out any issues with Russia. But because he died, unfortunately, we don't know what will happen. But Truman did do some things. He helped create the Marshall Plan, which was used to help rebuild Europe after the war. He helped create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which was kind of used, again, to prevent the spread of communism among bunch of nations, not only the United States. And then there was the arms race, where both the U.S. and the Soviet Union began making atomic weapons and other types of new technology, just more and more. And at the same time was the space race. So they also made, the rocket ships to race to the moon and all that. And finally, there was the creation of the CIA, which was used for more spying on people, more than already has happened in the past. Mainly, people that are seen as communists, that the government thinks are communists. Even in the government, they will start, searching people, employees that work in the government to see if they're communists, and they would actually fire people if they thought they were, even if they weren't, without proof. Now we have the Civil Rights Movement, which happened. Well, it's been happening, since the beginning, of, I'd say even after the Civil War ended. But it grew and grew and grew until around the 60s and 70s. In the 50s, though, the landmark Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education said that the segregation of schools for children of color violated the Constitution. And there was a lot of different events during the Civil Rights era. On the bottom here is one of the most famous ones, which were the Greensboro Sit-Ins, where 4 African American students sat in a white-only section in a diner and asked for some donuts and coffee. The owners refused because, it was the white-only section. They were allowed to do so. And then the African-American students protested, but brought more people and more people over the course of a few months until there were hundreds of people at this diner sitting in the whites-only section asking for coffee, and donuts. And then at that point, they accepted. And that was one of the biggest events in the Civil Rights era. There was also the Freedom Rides, where people, African American and white students, sat in buses to protest the segregation on buses. That was pretty bad because it ended in whenever they got off the bus, they would be mobbed, and sometimes some of them were killed or beaten. But a lot of people put their lives on the line just to get equal rights. But there was also a lot of other movements too. There was the women's liberation movement, which was, again, it was like the feminist movement. They're pretty similar. There was the gay liberation movement, which, it was homosexual and gay people, asking to get equal rights, just like everyone else. The Chicano Rebellion, which was when figures like Cesar Chavez, and there was others too, worked for better rights for migrant workers and farmers in the South and in Mexico, like the border of Mexico too, but also in the southern United States. And then the Black Power movement, which was a militant group of kind of like nationalist African Americans that were more inspired by the making of their own society rather than peaceful protesting like Martin Luther King did. They focused more on, making sure Black people are situated, that they're fine, that they have, they can do things on their own. Whereas people like Martin Luther King focused on, peaceful protest, not saying anything to other people, even if they're, like yelling them, calling them names, marching, sit-ins, those kinds of things are the peaceful protests. Whereas Black Power movement would, bring guns to intimidate people, say, we want our own rights. So there was 2 very different movements at the time, but it never really got to the point of like Black people, like shooting other people or rioting like that. It was always, riots caused by racism and, white Americans seeing Black people as, inferior, or they wanted to keep segregation. Around the same time too, from the 50s to the 70s, there was a lot going on in this time period, was the Vietnam War. Now, this is a really weird one because really the United States didn't really know what they were getting into with the Vietnam War. So it's also known as the Second Indochina War because the First Indochina War was between France and Vietnam. And this is kind of how the Vietnam War started. France actually owned Vietnam. It was a colony, and they wanted their colony back. So what happened was France invaded Vietnam. They tried to take it back and created their own government in the south. The North Vietnamese, though, the ones who had just been freed they became independent because of the wars. They fought back, and they were actually very strong, and France couldn't beat them. So they called the United States for help, and the United States decided to help them because it just so happened that the North Vietnamese government was communist, and because the United States was so scared and fearful of communism, they decided to, help in. And the Vietnamese weren't trying to spread communism. They weren't trying to, they weren't like the Soviet Union trying to gain more power or China at the time. They weren't doing that. They were just fighting for independence. That's what they were fighting for. And that's what France and the U.S. didn't really understand. And the U.S. actually did a lot of damage to Vietnam, committing various war crimes. This image here on the left is an image from the My Lai massacre, which was probably the most well-known and worst event of them all in Vietnam, where American soldiers killed several women and babies that were innocent. They weren't soldiers or anything. There was no soldiers in the village. They just decided to kill them. They also raided Cambodia and Laos as well. And they actually made a worse communist threat in Cambodia with the Pol Pot incident. Pol Pot was a communist ruler who he was much worse than anything the Vietnamese government did. They were just fighting for their freedom. But many people in the U.S. actually resisted and protested against the war. Things like draft dodging, which means hiding from getting drafted into the military. Symbolic messages like wearing armbands to protest the war with messages on them, and marches and protests. However, with all this fighting, with all of their resources, the U.S. was actually not able to win this war. Just like in the Korean War, which I think I forgot to mention earlier, but it wasn't as important, but basically a similar situation as the Vietnam War. And the U.S. lost both the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And now we get to the last slide I have for today, which is the Reagan Era, which was from the 70s to 2008. The Reagan Era is named after President Ronald Reagan. He is seen as kind of the most influential figures when it comes to the conservative coalition, the conservative movement. Much like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR is seen as a very liberal, more for like social rights and welfare type president. He was more conservative. So what happened during the Reagan era basically was a lot of taxes were reduced, spending was reduced, but the military spending was actually increased because, again, this was all going on during the Cold War. The Cold War doesn't end until 1990. That's because the Soviet Union collapsed. A lot of communist countries in Eastern Europe collapsed, and a lot of other countries that followed those countries also collapsed. But because of the tax cuts, they actually had to be raised again, the taxes, because it caused a deficit in the U.S. government's money. So they actually had to raise taxes again. So it actually was kind of harmful in the end. But in 1996, the Republicans were able to, I believe they controlled Congress at the time. They passed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, which placed limits on federal assistance, like the things FDR made to help citizens during the Great Depression. So a lot of that assistance was now cut or limited because of this act. Reagan was also involved in a scandal. It was called the Iran-Contra affair, which they proved that he was secretly selling illegal weapons to Iran, which the U.S. government was not allowed to do because of a law. And then he used the money he got from Iran to fund rebels in Nicaragua. And this is nothing new. This has been going on, for since American history started. The American government has interfered with a lot of countries in Latin America. If not interfered, actually invaded them. There was Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt invaded a lot of Latin American countries. Like in Panama, he made the Panama Canal by starting a revolution, and they funded. Reagan funded I think the leader Pinochet in Chile. So yeah, he was involved in a lot of interference with other countries. And that's really the end of the Reagan era. The last thing I have here is the September 11th attacks, which happened September 11th, obviously, but it happened. Was caused by the Islamist terrorist group Al Qaeda. There was 4 attacks. One of them failed because the people on the plane were brave enough to fight the terrorists and crash the plane in a not important location. But the other ones hit. The Twin Towers, as you can see here on the right. Those are 2 planes hit. One plane hit each tower. There was the Pentagon, which is the headquarters of the American military. The president's advisors are there. And then there was one in I forget what the other one was. But this started something called the Global War on Terrorism, and the U.S. started to intervene and start wars throughout the Middle East. There was tons of wars. There's a war in Afghanistan, war in Iraq, and many different events that happened, and they're just ending now, actually. I believe our president has just declared that they're finally taking all the troops out of the Middle East. But we still have things like the Homeland Security Department for, protecting against terrorism and stuff like that, which has been pretty vital since then. But that's it for the history. I know it's a lot, but thank you for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the questions and answers, and thank you.
And yeah, I believe we are on tomorrow, not next week, as the slide says, for culture. Is that correct?
Yes.
Excellent.
We have culture, sports, religion, different types of people, music. We have a lot planned for tomorrow.
All that jazz, including jazz, literally. All right. Excellent. I guess we stick around for a little bit to see what's up, but otherwise, that's the presentation for today. So anyone who must go, feel free to head off. Have a good evening and all that, and hopefully we'll be able to catch you tomorrow. If you have questions, Jordan's already covered all this. Ask away, and we'll chill for a little bit.
Wish we have some of the more of that music that Jelly was playing.
Oh yes, wait.
Bring back the piano.
Hey. Oh, here we go.
you.